Her tiny hands were shaking as she gripped the charcoal fabric of the stranger's sleeve. Tears left streaks through the dirt on her face, her voice a jagged whisper that pierced the room. "Please, they're killing my mother." The restaurant went dead silent. The sound of silver hitting porcelain stopped instantly. Every eye in the room turned toward the head table. But the man this little girl had chosen to beg wasn't just a stranger. He was Lucas Whitmore, the ghost, the most feared man in the city. And what he did next would leave everyone in that room breathless. Stay with me until the very end, because the way this night ends will shock you to your core. Before we dive into the ghost decision, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below with your city. Let's get into it. It's a rain-slicked evening in the heart of the city. Inside the Obsidian, the air is thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the hum of high-stakes power. This wasn't a place for families. This was Lucas Whitmore's inner sanctum. Every guard at the door was trained to spot a threat from a mile away. Every waiter knew that a single spilled drink could be their last day on the job. In this world, there were two rules: mind your business and never, ever interrupt a meeting of the families. Lucas Whitmore sat at the center of it all, a man of shadows and steel. With his slicked-back hair and the tattoos peeking from beneath his tailored cuffs, he looked every bit the king he was. At the prime of his power, Lucas didn't lead with passion, he led with ice. He had spent decades excising every ounce of empathy from his heart, believing that sentiment was a death sentence. Tonight he was finalizing the biggest territorial takeover of the decade. Numbers were being crunched, borders were being drawn, problems were being solved with cold surgical precision. Lucas had survived the streets because he understood one fundamental truth: emotions are a liability. Until a girl in a torn pink dress proved him wrong. In the dim amber glow of the restaurant, Lucas Whitmore didn't just occupy space, he dominated it. He was a man carved from the very shadows he commanded, sitting motionless as the surrounding chaos of the city's elite hummed at a respectful distance. To the public, he was a mystery wrapped in a $5,000 charcoal suit. But to those who navigated the city's jagged underbelly, he was simply the ghost. He earned the name not because he was invisible, but because he was untouchable. He moved through the world without leaving a footprint of emotion, a man who had successfully turned his heart into a vault of cold iron. His reputation was built on a foundation of silence and absolute predictability. In the underworld, where hot-headed men died young, Lucas's chilling composure was his greatest weapon. He didn't scream and he didn't threaten, he merely looked at a problem until it withered. His tattoos peeking from beneath his crisp white cuffs were the only roadmap of a violent past, inked reminders of a time before he had learned to mask his rage behind the elegance of a king. Every man at his table, from his most trusted lieutenants to the rival dons he was currently absorbing, understood the hierarchy. When Lucas spoke, the air in the room seemed to thin, leaving everyone else breathless as they waited for his verdict. He lived by a singular, rigid philosophy: power is maintained through the absence of feeling. To Lucas, empathy was a leak in a ship, a small crack that would eventually drown even the strongest captain. For 15 years he had operated with the mechanical precision of a watchmaker, dividing territories and settling debts without ever letting his pulse quicken. He was the architect of an empire that stretched from the docks to the penthouse suites, held together by the terrifying certainty that the ghost never blinked and never forgot. Tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of that icy logic. As he swirled a vintage Cabernet, he was seconds away from signing a deal that would grant him total control over the northern corridors. His lieutenants watched him with a mixture of reverence and terror, knowing that one word from Lucas could elevate a man to a millionaire or consign him to the earth. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of success and the quiet rhythmic clinking of fine china, a symphony of order that Lucas had spent a lifetime perfecting. He was a mountain of a man at the peak of his power, utterly convinced that nothing in this world could ever penetrate the charcoal armor he wore. He was wrong. As the little girl's plea hung in the air, the sterile, expensive silence of the restaurant began to dissolve, replaced by the ghost of a sound Lucas had buried decades ago. It was the sound of a rain-drenched tire skidding on asphalt and the muffled thud of a door being kicked off its hinges. Suddenly, the charcoal suit and the heavy weight of his empire felt like a thin veil threatening to rip and reveal the boy he had been in 1998, a boy who had hidden in a kitchen cupboard, peering through a crack in the wood. In that memory, the air didn't smell like vintage wine. It smelled of metallic iron and cheap floor wax. He could still see his mother, a woman whose laughter had been the only light in their cramped tenement, standing between him and three men whose faces were blurred by the shadows of their hooded coats. He remembered the way her hands had shaken, just like Ella's were shaking now, as she begged them to take whatever they wanted, so long as they left her son alone. But in the world Lucas grew up in, mercy was a currency that no one traded. He had watched, paralyzed by a terror that had frozen his very blood as the light in her eyes was extinguished. The men had laughed, a jagged, hollow sound that echoed in his nightmares for 1,000 Tuesdays afterward. When the police finally arrived, they found a 10-year-old boy who refused to cry, standing over a body he could no longer protect. That night, Lucas Whitmore had made a silent, solemn pact with the darkness. He realized that the only way to never feel that crushing powerlessness again was to become the thing people feared. He would build walls so high that no scream could climb them. He would become a ghost so that no one could ever hurt what wasn't there. Every ruthless decision, every cold-blooded takeover, and every emotion he had strangled in the crib over the last 25 years had been a brick in that fortress. He had convinced himself that by feeling nothing, he had finally won. But as he looked down at the small, desperate hand clutching his sleeve, the iron vault in his chest groaned under the pressure. The ghost was staring into the eyes of his own past, and for the first time since 1998, the ice was beginning to crack. The little girl wasn't just asking for a stranger's help. She was reaching through time, pulling the boy out of the cupboard and demanding that he finally find his voice. The heavy silence of the restaurant snapped like a dry bone. Lucas stood up so abruptly that his heavy oak chair skidded backward, the screech of wood against marble sounding like a gunshot. His lieutenants froze, their forks suspended in midair, their faces masks of utter bewilderment. Marcus, his second-in-command, reached out a hand, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Lucas? The contracts. We haven't signed. The Italians are waiting for the confirmation call." But Lucas didn't hear him. The ghost was gone, replaced by a man possessed by a frantic, driving heat. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't give an order. He simply scooped Ella up, her small weight a jarring reminder of everything he had tried to forget, and headed for the exit. His security details scrabbled to keep pace, their hands hovering over their concealed weapons, their eyes darting around the room to find the invisible enemy that had spooked their boss. They had seen him face down firing squads without blinking, yet here he was, sprinting toward the revolving glass doors because of a child's whisper. Outside, the city was weeping. A torrential downpour turned the neon lights of downtown into blurred smears of red and blue. Lucas ignored his waiting limousine, shoving past a startled valet and plunging into the rain. "Which way?" he barked, his voice raw. Ella pointed toward the East End, toward the skeletal remains of the industrial district, where the streetlights flickered and died. He ran. He ran with a desperation that defied his age and his status, his expensive leather suit splashing through oily puddles, the charcoal wool of his suit soaking through and heavy. Behind him, his men followed in a confused, panting phalanx, unable to comprehend why the king of the city was racing toward a neighborhood he had spent millions to rise above. They reached the tenement building in minutes, a crumbling brick monolith that looked like a tombstone against the gray sky. The front door hung on a single hinge, and the stairwell smelled of rot and damp concrete. Every step upward was a rhythmic echo of the clock ticking in Lucas's head. His heart, a muscle he had spent 15 years trying to silence, was now hammering against his ribs with a singular, terrifying message. Not again. Not this time. As they reached the third floor, a muffled scream erupted from behind a scarred wooden door, and the ghost finally let his rage out of the shadows. The heavy wooden door didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of Lucas's boot. He charged into the flickering shadows of the apartment, a predator entering a cage. The air inside was thick with the scent of copper and fear. In the center of the room, a woman lay huddled on the floor, her hands shielding her head as a man loomed over her, his fist raised for another blow. Two other figures stood by the window, laughing as they tossed a meager handful of crumpled bills on the floor, the protection money they had come to collect. "Get away from her!" Lucas's voice didn't just fill the room, it shook the very foundation of the building. The men spun around, their hands instinctively reaching for the pistols tucked into their waistbands, but as the dim light from the hallway caught Lucas's face, they froze. The aggression drained from their expressions, replaced by a paralyzing, bone-deep terror. These weren't rival gang members. They weren't strangers from a different territory. They were wearing the signature dark overcoats and silver lapel pins of the Whitmore organization. They were Lucas's own cleanup crew, a unit that was supposed to be miles away handling a shipment at the docks. "Boss?" the tallest one stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "What are you doing here? This is just a routine collection, a little reminder for the neighborhood." Lucas looked at the woman on the floor, Sarah. Her lip was split, and her eyes were wide with the same haunting desperation he had seen in his mother's face 26 years earlier. Then he looked back at his soldiers. These were the men he had handpicked. These were the men he had trusted to maintain the order of his empire. In an instant, the cold logic of the ghost was insurrected by a white-hot realization. He hadn't built a kingdom of honor. He had built a breeding ground for monsters. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. His own men were using his name, his power, and his protection to terrorize a mother and child over a few dollars, while he sat in a five-star restaurant discussing millions. The rot wasn't outside his walls, it was the foundation they were built on. Behind him, Marcus and the rest of his security detail poured into the room, stopping short as they saw their colleagues standing over the bruised woman. The tension in the hallway was a live wire, ready to snap. Lucas stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the man who had struck Sarah. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone felt like a death sentence. "You did this in my name?" he whispered, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than any shout. The three soldiers began to back away, realizing too late that they hadn't just broken a rule, they had woken a ghost that was no longer interested in silence. The silence that followed Lucas's whisper was more violent than the storm outside. For 15 years, Lucas Whitmore had been a strategist, a man who delegated the dirty work to avoid the stain of the streets. But as he looked at the bruise forming on Sarah's cheek, the ghost evaporated, leaving behind a man who finally remembered how to bleed. He didn't wait for an excuse or a plea. He moved with a blurred, predatory speed that bypassed his own security detail, his hand closing around the throat of the man who had struck the mother. The soldier, a man nearly Lucas's size, was lifted off his feet and slammed against the peeling wallpaper with a force that cracked the plaster. The other two traitors fumbled for their guns, but they were paralyzed by a fundamental law of the underworld. You do not raise a hand against the ghost. They watched in horror as Lucas, the man who prided himself on surgical precision, discarded his charcoal jacket and unleashed a raw, primitive fury. He wasn't fighting for territory or to send a message to a rival boss. He was fighting for the 10-year-old boy who had been too small to stop the men in 1998. Each blow Lucas landed was a shattering of his own icy philosophy. He felt the sting in his knuckles and the heat in his chest, sensations he had spent a lifetime suppressing. He disarmed the second soldier with a brutal efficiency, the man's pistol clattering across the floor before sending him crashing through a rotted coffee cable. The apartment, once a place of quiet poverty, became a theater of reckoning. Lucas's men stood in the doorway, their faces pale. They had seen the ghost kill, but they had never seen him care. This wasn't a business execution. This was an exorcism. When the three soldiers lay broken and groaning on the floor, Lucas didn't stand over them with a triumphant sneer. Instead, he turned his back on them, the ultimate insult in their world, and knelt in the debris. The rain continued to lash against the window, but the air in the room had shifted. He reached out a hand to Sarah, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid his very presence might shatter what was left of the evening. "You're safe now," he said, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, his voice didn't sound like a tombstone. It sounded like a promise. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a silk handkerchief, pressing it gently to the wound on her lip. Behind him, Marcus stepped forward, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The Empire was still there, the power was still absolute, but the man at the center of it had changed. Lucas Whitmore had finally found something worth more than a cold victory. He had found a reason to stay human. The adrenaline of the fight began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharpened clarity that was far more dangerous than Lucas's initial rage. He stood up slowly, his eyes sweeping across the 3 broken men on the floor, before settling on his inner circle standing in the doorway. His gaze landed on Marcus, his right hand, the man who had been at his side through every turf war and every silent negotiation for a decade. "Marcus," Lucas said, his voice as flat as a blade. "Why did these men think they could come here? Why did they think my code, the code that keeps this city from burning to the ground, didn't apply to this neighborhood?" Marcus didn't flinch, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. The air in the cramped apartment grew heavy, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. The lieutenants in the hallway shifted uneasily, sensing a tectonic shift in the hierarchy. Lucas stepped over the wreckage of the coffee table, moving into Marcus's personal space. He noticed, for the first time, the subtle signs he had been too detached to see before, the slightly too expensive watch on Marcus's wrist, the way he didn't look at Sarah, but rather through her, as if she were an inconvenient piece of data. "The numbers were slipping, Lucas," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the tremor the others showed. "The high-end deals are clean, but they're slow. The streets, the protection from the small shops, the tenements, it's fast cash. It fills the gaps. I didn't think you'd care about the details as long as the bottom line stayed black." Lucas felt a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the fight. He realized that while he had been playing the role of the ghost, floating above the grime in his ivory tower, he had allowed his own shadow to grow claws. Marcus hadn't just broken a rule, he had commodified the very terror that had destroyed Lucas's childhood. He had turned Lucas's empire into the hooded men from 1998. "The code isn't a detail, Marcus," Lucas whispered, his eyes dark with a burgeoning lethal disappointment. "It's the only thing that separates us from the animals." He looked at the man he had called a brother and saw a stranger, a man who saw people as ledger entries and suffering as a gap filler. The betrayal was total. Marcus hadn't just stolen money or territory. He had stolen Lucas's belief that he was building something better than the chaos that killed his mother. The realization was a final chilling epiphany. To save the city, he first had to burn down the house he had built. The ride back to the heart of the city was conducted in a suffocating silence, the only sound the rhythmic thumb of the tires against the rain-slicked pavement. When the black sedans pulled into the subterranean garage of the Whitmore headquarters, a steel and glass fortress known as the Inner Sanctum, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of an impending storm. Lucas didn't wait for the doors to be opened. He stepped out, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal bruised knuckles and ink-stained forearms, his charcoal jacket left behind in a tenement hallway as a relic of a man who no longer existed. He strode through the lobby, his boots echoing like a countdown against the polished stone. In the grand boardroom, the remaining captains and high-ranking lieutenants were already gathered, whispered rumors of the night's chaos having traveled faster than the motorcade. When Lucas entered, the murmurs died instantly. He didn't take his seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights shimmering below like a sea of broken glass. Marcus stood by the door, his posture defiant, but his eyes darting toward the other men, looking for an ally in the greed he had fostered. Lucas turned slowly, his gaze raking over the men who had grown fat and comfortable under his detached rule. "For years," Lucas began, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded the room, "I told you that emotion was a liability. I told you that we were businessmen and that the details of the street were beneath us. I was wrong." He slammed a hand onto the mahogany table, the sound vibrating through the expensive Scotch glasses. "By ignoring the details, I allowed us to become the very filth we claimed to rise above. We have been preying on the weak to line our pockets with silver that smells like blood and tears. That ends tonight." A heavy tension settled over the room, the kind of tension that preceded a coup or a massacre. Lucas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "The new rule is simple. We protect this city. We do not extort the mothers, we do not terrorize the children, and we do not break the doors of the innocent. If you want to be a predator, find another jungle, but if you stay in this house, you answer to the ghost, and the ghost has finally opened his eyes." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, to argue for the logic of the old ways, but the words withered in his throat. In Lucas's eyes, there was no longer the cold emptiness of a ghost. There was the burning, righteous fire of a man who had reclaimed his soul. The game hadn't just changed, the board had been flipped. And for the first time in 15 years, the men in the room realized they weren't following a boss, they were following a leader. The transformation of Lucas Whitmore's empire began not with a grand speech, but with the quiet arrival of a private ambulance at the tenement's doorstep. While the underworld was still reeling from the purge at headquarters, Lucas's focus had shifted entirely to the third-floor apartment he had once entered as a stranger. Sarah Morgan was moved to a private wing of the city's most prestigious hospital under a name that commanded instant, terrified excellence from the staff. Specialists who usually treated senators and oil tycoons were summoned in the middle of the night to tend to a mother who had until hours ago been invisible to the world. Lucas didn't visit her bedside. He knew that his face, no matter how much his heart had thawed, was still the face of the monster that had sanctioned her pain. Instead, he watched through the tinted glass of his sedan parked in the shadows of the hospital courtyard. He watched Ella, now wearing a clean dress and clutching a new teddy bear sitting in a sunlit waiting room. For the first time, the girl wasn't shaking. She was safe, and the cost of that safety was a debt Lucas felt he could never fully repay. As Sarah's physical wounds began to heal, Lucas went to work on the scars that ran deeper. He didn't just pay her medical bills, he erased her past. He signed the deed to a small, bright house in a neighborhood where the trees lined the streets, and the police actually answered the phones. It was a place where the air didn't smell of rot, and the doors didn't need 4 locks to stay closed. He filled the pantry, set up a trust for Ella's education, and ensured that the ghost's shadow would serve as a permanent, invisible shield around the perimeter of their new life. He remained a phantom in their recovery, a silent benefactor who moved through their world without ever touching it. He received daily reports on Sarah's progress and Ella's return to school, reading them with more intensity than he had ever given a profit-loss statement. Every successful day they spent in peace was a brick removed from the wall of his own trauma. He was learning that power was far more intoxicating when used to build than when used to break. From his distant vantage point, Lucas Whitmore watched the life he had saved flourish, realizing that while he could never go back to the boy in the cupboard, he could finally live with the man he had become. 10 years had passed, but the city's memory was long. The rain had ceased, replaced by a soft autumnal gold that bathed the quiet cemetery on the hill. Ella Morgan, no longer the trembling child in a torn dress, but a confident young woman with her mother's kind eyes, walked slowly along the stone path. She knelt, her movements graceful and unhurried. From her bag she pulled a single vibrant pink flower, a bloom that matched the color of the dress she had worn on the most terrifying night of her life. As she placed it against the marble, a soft smile touched her lips. She knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been looked after by an unseen hand for a decade, that she had never truly been alone. Every scholarship, every safe walk home, and every closed door that stayed shut against the world's cruelty had been a gift from a man she hadn't spoken to since she was 7 years old. Deep in the lengthening shadows of a nearby oak tree, a man stood motionless. Lucas Whitmore was older now, the slicked-back hair turned to a distinguished silver at the temples, his charcoal suit still impeccably tailored. The tattoos on his hands were faded, much like the violent empire he had dismantled and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. He no longer ruled through fear, he ruled through a quiet, ironclad protection of the city's vulnerable. He was still a ghost, perhaps, but a ghost that stood guard rather than one that haunted. He watched as Ella stood, brushed the grass from her coat, and took a deep breath of the crisp air. She looked toward the trees, and for a fleeting second, her eyes seemed to find his in the gloom. She didn't flinch, she didn't cry out. She simply nodded, a small, solemn acknowledgement of the man who had traded his soul to give her a future. As Ella turned to leave, her footsteps light and rhythmic, Lucas remained in the darkness until the sound of her car faded into the distance. He looked at the pink flower resting against the stone, a splash of color against the gray. The boy who had hidden in a cupboard in 1998 was finally at rest, and the man who had emerged was no longer a monster. Lucas adjusted his cuffs, took one last look at the life he had shielded, and faded back into the city he had vowed to protect. The debt was paid. The silence was finally peaceful.